He goes by the name Best Trousers on Twitter, but in reality his name is Matt Darling. He works as the Employment Policy Fellow at Niskanen, and he is your chief neoliberal shill for 2023, as decided by the voters. I sat down with Matt for a wide-ranging conversation about his reign as the new chief shill, what he thinks about the posting to policy pipeline, the impact that posting can have in Congress, his views on the labor market and employment policy, and so much more. It's a really fun conversation, and I think you'll enjoy it a lot. If you do enjoy the episode and the podcast, please subscribe, like, and if you really enjoy the podcast, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/neoliberalpodcast. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism and get lots of cool perks like access to our community Slack and access to bonus episodes. You can become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org. Thank you so much for your support, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Matt Darling. Matt, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jeremiah. Thanks so much for having me on.
It's incredible to have you on. For those of you who are not aware, Matt Darling was elected our chief neoliberal shill for 2023. It's been quite a journey for you, Matt. You've been kind of one of the old school, econ Twitter people for a long time. Before there really was even an econ Twitter,
Yeah.
you were in the Reddit forums, kind of fighting the good fight with people on Reddit, posting your way to success. So my first question is going to be, I guess, your background as an internet poster who deeply cares about economics and cares about getting things right, cares about spreading good economic knowledge to the world.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? What's your history there?
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know, right? There's part of it that is like the classic XKCD comic of like, oh my gosh, someone is wrong on the internet.
Yeah. What do you want me to do? Just allow them to continue being wrong?
Yeah, exactly. Here's what I'll say is that, but I was in grad school for economics 2008 to 2010, which is a fun time to be in grad school for economics because, you'd be in your macroeconomics class, you'd be learning how to solve Bellman equations and things like that. And then one day they say, okay, we're going to stop that and we're going to go review ISLM so you guys can all not get in trouble when your parents ask you questions about what is going on with the economy right now. And that is around the same time I joined Reddit.
Is this like immediately post Great Recession?
No, I'd say it's during Great Recession, right? Yeah. So I'd have to double check this, but I believe I started on my Reddit account like Christmas break 2008.
So there's a strong component of what the hell is going on with the economy that the everyman is kind of asking. That's kind of why you're introducing this, because it is a time. The early 2000s, you could specialize in economics and people wouldn't really ask you much. That's fine. But 2008, suddenly everybody wanted to ask questions to anybody with the title economist that they knew.
Right. Like in early 2000s, you could kind of be like, oh yeah, I've read Freakonomics. Here's these cool, anecdotes I have about sumo wrestlers. And then 2008, people were like, so what's going to happen with Bear Stearns? And you're like, I don't know. And so, as you mentioned, like around then, I started posting on Reddit. Some friends of mine who are like computer science people sort of connected me on it. And I went to the econ forum. The econ forum was atrocious. It was very, very bad. And so I ended up r/economics, and I ended up spending a lot of my time arguing with sort of Ron Paul fans and Austrian business cycle, or pseudo-Austrian business cycle folks.
It's funny how much Reddit has changed, because early in Reddit's life, it was very Ron Paul, into the Fed, gold bugs, in terms of the econ things, but just generally overall, Reddit had this libertarian Ron Paul vibe. And that is not the case anymore.
That's not the case right now. Like, there's something that happened in 2016 where, like, someone flipped a switch and everybody took off their Ron Paul hats and put on their Bernie Sanders hats.
Yes.
And, I don't know where it is right now. To the extent I do spend time on the forum, I mostly spend it in our neoliberal, which I think is probably not a great, catching of the aggregate Reddit vibe. But anyways, I was on that, and like one that was both like really useful in terms of taking that sort of initial like knowledge of economics you're getting both from studying it in school, but like then taking it a little bit more seriously, getting the master's degree. So you're going and commenting on these things, but also like you started being able to do, we didn't have the term back then, but like I was able to ratio people, where you'd go and someone would say something, and you'd be like, oh, that's incorrect, and here are the 4 reasons why it's incorrect. And there's this sort of funny thing that I think people always like, oh yeah, when you argue with people on the internet, like you can't actually change their minds, you can maybe change the audience's minds. And like, I feel like I'm very early in my internet posting history, I was able to change people's minds. Maybe it was just being at the right place at the right time. But that's very, there's a rush to that, right? Of being like someone being like, oh man, I had not thought about it in that way before. That's a really good point. A good example of this is like, and it's so funny right now because as you said, like the zeitgeist has changed so much. But like in 2008, 2009, 2010, I feel like I was the only person on the internet who had read any papers about the monopsony and the minimum wage, right? So, which is basically, there's a classic argument against the minimum wage. It's like, oh yeah, if you set a price floor, you end up having supply and demand out of equilibrium. You end up reducing the number of unemployment of people employed, and there's a history of papers, going back. Even to Joan Robinson in the 1930s, George Stigler in the 1940s, all acknowledged this and said, oh yeah, if there is a lot of employer bargaining power, that's not the case. That a moderate minimum wage increase can actually increase employment. And of course that came out with like the big disputes around Card-Kruger in 1996. But like, no one who was commenting on Reddit had like read those specific papers. Like maybe they had seen, the Card-Kruger results, but they weren't aware of like the theoretical backstops. It's very funny because like that was again like something that I felt almost like the only person who knew that stuff that was posting online 2008, 2010. And now I think that's pretty common knowledge. Like everybody sort of understands that like that's not a controversial point on the minimum wage sort of disputes anymore. Everyone has sort of said, oh yes, you can dispute, how big a monopsony is, how important it is, whether the government can set it correctly or not. But that sort of overall, oh, here's this point that comes, strictly out of classic neoclassical economic theory, like that point wasn't acknowledged at that point in time, and that's changed that since.
So you got a rush in this kind of early days of Reddit from basically being able to be a more knowledgeable voice, and whether you're convincing the person themselves or convincing the audience, I think it is true that arguments on the internet can matter to some extent. A lot of people throughout the life of the internet and social media have emphasized like the internet is not real life, but increasingly it is.
Yeah.
Increasingly it is. And one of the most interesting questions we got when we kind of asked people, on social media, hey, Matt Darling's coming on the show. What should we ask him? They wanted me to ask you about what they call the posting to policy pipeline. And I think this is legitimate because you were not really in think tank world. You worked in like a behavioral econ firm. But it wasn't really a think tank, although the work you did was maybe adjacent, was maybe similar to being in a think tank. But so how do you view kind of that, like, I don't know, that paradigm of, number one, your personal journey from kind of just being a poster to being an actual think tanker.
Yeah.
And number two, how does posting actually influence policy at the legislative or the federal executive level?
Yeah, no, these are great questions, and I'll say it's something that I still struggle with and be like, okay, how do I, get the ideas that I, want to make policy into that sort of policy apparatus. In terms of like the personal journey, yeah. So I was working at Ideas 42, which is behavioral economics R&D shop, think tank, consultancy. You could describe it a lot of different ways. But I was doing a lot of work on taking insights from behavioral economics and applying them to real world problems. Among that, I was doing a lot of work with the Department of Labor, right? So basically, and if you think about what I was doing, like you can think about like operationalizing a lot of the way people thought about the book Nudge, right? So Nudge has, tremendous, interesting sorts of things, lab experiments, and then broader economic papers and field experiments and stuff like that. But really, a lot of what we were doing is saying, okay, how do you actually, say, hey, here's this, problem that we're facing at, the Department of Labor or Health and Human Services or anything, and apply a behavioral lens to that and come up with a way of fixing it. For example of some of the work that I was doing with the Department of Labor, we were doing some work on reemployment programs. So there's a program called RESCEA. I can't recall the acronym off the top of my head. It's changed from REA from when I was working on it. But it's, reemployment and support services. But basically, it's a mandatory program that a lot of people who are receiving unemployment insurance are required to come in and do sort of a in-person meeting with folks. And it's mandatory. Like, if you do not go to this meeting, you can be kicked off unemployment insurance because you're in violation of it. And we were working with a group in Michigan, and they had about a 50% show-up rate for this. And you think, that's a pretty low show-up rate for something that you can have a 50% chance of, you can get kicked off of UI. And all we did is like rewrite some of their emails that were in their communications and be like, put into language that humans can understand, not just like, aha, here is this big, long, complicated summons from the government. And then we were able to, bump that up to 85%. So I was doing that work. And then the pandemic happened, right? And the pandemic was, March 2020 was for a lot, either the most productive time in your life or the least productive time, depending on like what kind of weird personality you have. But like one thing, I sort of said, hey, I actually know a lot about these employment systems, how they're working, what they're doing on the ground. And then a lot of the commentary I was seeing was just so divorced from that, right? So the classic thing that people were talking about is like, when they implemented FPUC, or they're proposing FPUC, which is the adding $600 to everybody's UI weekly benefits. And people sort of said, oh my gosh, they were really freaking out because you're going to start paying people more to be on unemployment insurance than they would be if they were employed at their old job. And, and that sort of makes logical sense in some levels. And I was like, the thing I just started yelling at everybody is like, listen, this is temporary unemployment insurance, and workers, and this is so not a behavioral economics point, but like workers are actually thinking about their long-time permanent consumption function. It's Milton Friedman's permanent income hypothesis. Once you integrate that into your worldview, you say, well, it doesn't matter how much the instantaneous UI payment is. It's completely irrelevant in terms of how, people actually are approaching these sorts of questions. And so I spent a lot of time just sort of yelling about that. Had always been doing other sorts of broad commentary. So like, on Reddit and stuff like that, when the on Jobs Friday, I'd go and post like the big thread for people to talk about it in. And then you'd go and argue with people who say, oh my gosh, like actually, true employment is actually 47%. And you're like, no, it's really not. Like it really is not 47%. I mean, you can, there's different ways of measuring it. There's some, there's broader and more narrow ones, but like, there are ways that there are things that are meaningful, and there's numbers that people just make up to post to Zero Hedge or whatever. And anyways, so at that point, around that point in time, the Niskanen Center they put out a posting for an employment policy analyst, and I said, oh, that's really interesting, right? And like, going from the world where I was doing, nitty gritty, how does DOL send out their letters, and how can you, change the process by which like OSHA summons work and stuff like that. And then during COVID, I was like, oh my gosh, like, how does the UI system work as a whole, and how do people misunderstand this, and how can I sort of rectify those misunderstandings was big. And so I said, oh, that sounds really, really interesting. And of course, like, during COVID, like it felt like, trying to get the policy right was just so important that I was just like, oh yeah, I would really, really love to jump on that opportunity. And of course, like, had met Sam Hammond and other folks in Niskanen a couple times and had, been longtime admirers of them. So I was very excited to get that. And so anyways, you asked about like the posting the policy pipeline, and it's always tricky because trying to figure out like, where does, there's these people will post stuff on Twitter and then does become policy 2 years later, and you can never really trace out what is the flow of events, right?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately we're asking to some extent here, where does change come from?
Yeah.
And that is this ephemeral question that I feel like is unanswerable, but you can kind of point in specific directions sometimes.
Yeah, and like it's interesting because like again, I've only been in the think tank world for like I get about 2 years now, and so like legislation takes a long time to happen, and any sorts of changes happen. But it is one of those things where like it is one of those things where I've had meetings with folks at the Department of Labor or, staffers, congressional staffers, and they're like, I introduce myself and they're like, Matt Darling, so great to meet you. I love all the stuff you say on Twitter. And you're like, oh, that's weird. Or even like, like there are people who, were, posting, with outside the administration, Ernie Tedeschi, or Michelle Evermore, who
Austin Goolsby,
who now, are not on Twitter anymore, but, presumably are, you'd like to imagine, are still reading your things and being like, aha. But, like, I think, the policy...
And we have heard, of course, that Jay Powell has a burner account.
And follows
Econ on Twitter.
And is, will know if you get retweeted by Noah Smith, as Claudia Sam has found out. But, I mean, we talk about posting, but posting is just ideas, right? Posting is just writing. Sam had a good line once where he was like, writing a white paper is just posting with footnotes. And I think, it is that sort of like you try to get ideas out of the world, you fight for those ideas, and you try to also, push those through the legislative process by talking to congressmen, by talking to congressional staff. But like it is that sort of like, yeah, ideas have the policy to change things.
So one of the things that you've mentioned several times here is that it's kind of a motivating factor for you when you see people who are wrong on the internet, whether that's on Reddit or Twitter, and whether they're wrong in a good-spirited way, they're just confused, or whether they're just people who are advocating for really bad policy. But that leads me to a question about the labor market, because that's where you work. You work in kind of the intersection of behavioral and labor, but especially labor these days.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most common misconception about the labor market that people have right now?
What people have right now is fascinating because like there's 3 or 4 different ones that bug me a lot. I think the one that probably bugs me the most right now is that conception of like no one wants to work anymore. You don't see that as much like maybe the last 6 months, but that was a huge thing in 2021, 2022. But basically, people were, what you saw, post-pandemic, post-ARP is, a huge surge in the number of people who are working, that we had this incredibly fast economic recovery within the labor market, maybe not in GDP. No, I did in GDP too. But like, and astonishing, especially when you compare it to the financial crisis, 2008, 2001, or anything like that. It just rocketed right up there. And what you end up seeing, and especially right now, is we actually have, very, very high employment rates. That people who want to work are able to find jobs, are able to do that. Which also means that if you are an employer and you're trying to hire someone, that's incredibly difficult because almost everybody you want who wants a job has one already.
This is almost like you could say it's like a conservative coded complaint. Nobody wants to work, or like just someone coming from the perspective of trying to hire. It's hard to hire, so nobody wants to work because I can't get somebody.
I think that's right. It's mostly conservative code. Give me a second because I want to get past that a little bit. But like that, there is that sort of thing where it's hard to hire right now. Businesses are always complaining about that. And of course, if you're, a congressperson, like you hear from businesses who are complaining about that and you're like, oh, how can we solve this problem of no one wanting to work anymore? And again, like it's just something that isn't there when you actually look at, okay, what do employment statistics look like? That employment statistics are, we're at a a 21st century high for the prime age, which is 25 to 55 employment rate, which is pretty good. We still want to go and hit that 1999 high. We still want to, surpass Canada's level. But, this has been a really, really tight labor market that people should be really excited
We're at
about.
a multi-decade high for that, and we're at a multi-decade low for the unemployment rate.
Exactly.
I brought up that it's conservative coded because I also feel like there's another one that you see that is more progressive coded.
Yeah.
And that is that the labor market is secretly really bad. And that, we have all these numbers that say comparatively things are really great. They're better than they have been in a decade or two. And you can do that across many different metrics, whether it's median pay or unemployment rate or employment to population ratio. But a lot of progressives will try to find a way to say, well, but what if it's part-time jobs? But what if it's this? But, it's all minimum wage. It's all really shitty conditions or and this is widespread in the fact that I looked up a number here. Something like 75% of likely voters in late 2022 thought that we were in a recession. Not that a recession.
Not that a recession might be coming, but we're currently
that we were
one,
actively in a recession. And it's if this is what people think that we are in a recession right now, why are the vibes so bad at a time when the economy objectively is running really hot, is running too hot, so that we have to actually cool it down because inflation is so high?
Yeah. No. So let me add something to what you were saying before I maybe answer your question. But I think you're right. The sort of no one wants to work side is extremely conservative, business friendly coded. And then there's another sort of one where you see this every once in a while where people sort of try to switch it around. It's not that no one wants to work anymore. It's they don't want to be exploited by the corporations anymore. It's no, people are getting exploited by the corporations as much as ever. If that's how you define the workforce.
If you define private employment as exploitation.
Yeah, exactly.
Then there's going to be lots of.
There's going to be lots of that right now. And it's actually one thing I've been talking a lot about. There's a concept, especially on the left right now, that we're in this bold new age of labor militancy. And there's facets in which that's true, right? You have the Amazon warehouse unionizing. You've got Starbucks unionizing. And those are, I don't want the people who have done that. Those are real successes. I don't want to take that away from them. At the same time, and I don't have the numbers on top of my head, but at least at one point, I'm if you organized every single Starbucks in America, that gives you as many new union members as we saw in just the reduction in the Teamsters last year.
Union rates have been falling for decades, and they have just continued to fall. And regardless of what you're saying are very high-profile, potentially union victories, they're not making a dent in the overall trend.
Yeah. They're not making a dent in the overall trend. And then, and I don't have these numbers off the top of my head, but if you go and you look at your number of workers who are on strike at any given time, if you look at, how many unions are, you can sort of point to different ways of doing it. A lot of things I'll see is people putting out press releases and saying, 2022 saw, the highest, a 30% increase in union formation over 2021. You're well, no one did anything in 2021. You didn't organize birthday parties, you let alone organize a union.
This is something, by the way, that just researchers, a kid who's born today and who ends up doing research in grad school in the 2040s, right? Every single one of them is going to have to have data sets that say 1990 to 2040, excluding 2020 and 2021.
Yeah.
Every single data set forever is going to have to exclude those 2 points because otherwise their data is going to be just screwed. Yeah.
And even when you go and look at some things which you are seeing legitimate improvements, you're it's legitimate improvements, but it's back to where we were in 2006. If you're saying, we're forming new unions at the same rate as we did during the second Bush term. That's not the same. That's not the vibe you get on Twitter, right? That there is this sort of error. But going to your point about there's this sort of negativity about this, and so there's this negativity bias that you see on Twitter, where both on the left and on the right, that people are always sort of looking for bad things to talk about.
Nobody wants to believe that the economy is actually doing pretty well right now.
Yeah. I mean, or pretty well minus inflation, right?
Or even if they admit that it's doing pretty well, all they want to focus on is the bad thing. Which, I get that for some people, the goal of commentary is to point out things that are wrong in society so that we can fix them. But then it's if that's all you ever do, you never admit actually my policy worked. Sometimes I just want to tell people, like, the thing you advocated for is a good thing.
Yeah.
And we did it, and now, like, be happy.
No, I mean, we saw this so much during, like, the CARES Act, and, like, where, people got lots of money through UI, through economic stimulus, through big benefit snaps, and then people saying, all we got is a $1,200 check, and you're like, that's not...
Do you want to relive the debate about whether 14 plus 6
oh my God.
that the $1,400 check and the $600 check, and were you stabbed in the back because you were promised 2,000?
And I mean, so many people were, and it's so funny because, like, that was, like, a month of conversation on Twitter, and, like, clearly did not matter, too. Like, there's, the 200 people on Twitter who are very concerned about this, none of whom were, like, Georgia voters who could ostensibly at least say that they were promised that. And then, it's not like that was a big deal later on. But I think the point that you raised earlier, I think is a really good one, is that, I think there's this theory of political change that people have, which is like you point out how bad stuff is, or you overemphasize how bad stuff is. And I don't want to say that stuff is not bad. Like there's a way in which, we do not live in the best of all possible worlds, right? I think that the Max Roswell world of data has, like, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's like the world is better, the world could be so much better, or something like that. He has a much better phrase.
So I just pulled it up, and it's, the world is awful, the world is much better, the world can be much better.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's true, especially when you're looking at, like, a global... I think it's honestly a little dramatic to say that, like, in the United States, the richest, most powerful country in the world, that things are awful.
Yeah.
So, certainly, things in particular areas can be bad,
Yeah.
but awful seems like a stretch to me. But there's many places in the world where there's still deep, horrible poverty.
Yeah.
But objectively, it has gotten much better than it was 20 years ago. And, and that was better than it was 50 years ago, which was better than it was 100 years ago. And, like, the timeline is encouraging. And then I think what people are focused on, if I want to give them credit, if I want to just yell at them for being doomers, maybe I just call them stupid. But if I want to interpret them charitably, maybe they're focusing on this last part. The world can be much better. And they're thinking that in order to make it much better, they need to highlight the parts that need to get better, I guess.
And I don't think that's entirely wrong, but one of the, there's some interesting research that's, looked into this. And, like, people are, if you make people feel like they're in financial distress, like, they're actually a little bit less generous to other folks. They're less likely to go and organize to increase, the size of social insurance policies in the United States. Because you say, okay, like, if you think that the economy is about to collapse, like, the natural inclination is to go buy some gold and guns and protect your family, and not, go and say, like, okay, what are the how can we increase, SNAP payments or something like that. And so I do, again, like, absolutely, continue to point out where the rusty spots are in the economy or the world generally. But, like, also, it's important to be, to looking where there is forward progress and looking where you can, increase things. And then looking to, how do you build on those successes? How you can go and say, hey, we tried X. It seemed to work, fairly good. There's this one problem with it. Let's try to do it again and try to fix that problem.
All right, so you have been named the 2023 Chief Neoliberal Shill, following in the tradition of Matt Iglesias, Noah Smith, Scott Lincecum, Maya Mindell, now Matt Darling.
And Bastiat, you forgot Everett Warren. Yeah.
Oh, has Bastiat actually been?
Yeah, well, he was before Maya, right?
That's right. Oh, shit. There's been so many. It's funny.
It doesn't feel like it's been, like, 7 or 6 years or whatever.
You are the sixth. It's incredible how long we've been doing this, that it actually slipped my mind. Apologies to Warren Ray, Bastiat. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you immediately, as Chief Neoliberal Shill, one of your privileges and duties is to educate the masses. And it is a duty, but it is also a privilege in that you can emphasize particular areas of policy. So I guess 2 questions here. What area of policy do you think neoliberals should pay more attention to? And what's a political view that you think most neoliberals have that is wrong?
These are great questions. So I'll say, it's interesting because, like, because I have an actual job where I have an actual, like, well-defined area of interest, I want to mostly focus on that, mostly focus on employment policy, achieving full employment, having good UI systems, having, good ways of having sectoral shifts between sectors. And I think that's really important, but I'm also not sure if that's like the most important thing in the world.
That's actually, if I could ask you a pre-question here, what we focus on a lot is like immigration, trade policy, and housing. And certainly like social issues too. I think like trans rights are a big thing for most online neoliberals. And I think in terms of like what makes the biggest impact on the world, I'm a big fan of free trade, for instance, but I would say free trade doesn't matter that much right now.
Yeah.
The big drivers that like the things I really want that would have a huge impact are immigration and housing policy.
Yeah.
And so where do you think labor market policy fits in terms of level of importance?
I would make the point, like, and again, I don't know if I would say it's like the most important, but it is something where like it's a little bit neglected relative to the other ones. And that's one thing I'm trying to improve. That's me, saying, hey, I've got a comparative advantage here. I'm not necessarily going to be prescriptive and say everyone should be doing it. I would agree with you that like if you said, Matt, what is the most important things to do? I would pull up Michael Clemens' paper and say we are leaving these $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk, and
there you go.
And I think that's the gut instinct you should have. So I think that's right. And like, let me just add, like, immigration in developing world country stuff is just so important and like so neglected. And I agree with you that it's something that I think is really good about the neoliberal community or the effective altruism adjacent communities and stuff. Some ways like are really thinking about. But like when I was working at Ideas 42, like I would go and I would be doing work sometimes with subsistence level farmers, right? People who are going and growing crops primarily for them and their family to eat. And in addition, people who are selling cotton or people who are selling coffee or something like that. And like you going back to like the stuff we were talking about earlier, like the concerns that we have about the American economy and oh my gosh, we're not building enough housing it's just really hard to keep those things in mind when you say like, oh man, like there are people who a third of the world is living on $2 a day or roughly something like that. And it's one of the points I like to raise to people is there's so many people who are concerned about like, oh, all the bad things about capitalism. And, there's bad things about capitalism, bad things about anything. But, like, the big problem in the world is the people who do not have enough exposure to markets. The people who are, still in household-level autarky, eating food that they grew themselves.
And by household-level autarky, you mean basically having to produce everything that they, whether it's their own home, they built it, and it's probably just a shack.
Yeah.
And their own food, they have to grow it. And their own clothing, they might have to make their own clothing to some extent. And like, it's a very impoverished way to live that you don't have access to just sell your labor and buy all this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And not that like, going and selling your labor makes everything better either too, right? But like, there's plenty of people who move out of that, start farming cotton for some large cotton industry and get, are completely exploited, but are still probably somewhat better off than they were then.
It is interesting to me. This is a total sideline, but there's a resurgence on like TikTok, especially, I think, but in many ways in a lot of online spaces of like return to pastoralism.
Oh my gosh!
And it's something you can only do as a very rich like first world individual. That, wouldn't it be romantic if I grew my own vegetables in my garden and like I sew my own clothes? And I'm like, that is something you can only do because you have $150,000 a year day job, and like, then it's romantic for you.
It's not even the $150 day job. Like, what I think is really funny is people who do that, but that like advocating for that is also their lifestyle, right? Like they have a YouTube channel that they have subscriptions, and they go out and say, "Aha, here I am, going and farming. Please like and subscribe, and here's my Patreon."
Pastoralism influencers.
Yeah. And same thing, like a lot of people who do this like with financial independence, and they're like, "Oh, great, I got a $500,000 inheritance from my parents, and I moved to New Hampshire, and I'm homeschooling my children." And
I'm sorry, I have a story here. I have a friend from college, and this friend is a very nice person personally, but they are a financial influencer, and they kind of hit it big. They're a moderate level. They're not the biggest, but they're a moderate level. They make a good living from being a personal finance influencer. And their story that like helped them get big was like, I saved $600,000 in 6 years. And number one, I was like, how did that happen? Well, number one, at the beginning of the 6 years, they bought a house that appreciated in value like crazy. And number two, it was the 6 years when the stock market like tripled in price. And I was like, well, and number three, they had a job that made 6 figures. Look, if you have a job that makes 6 figures and the stock market triples and your house goes up in value 2x, yeah, maybe I could also make $500,000 in 6. Like, it's not that hard. Like, but it's just weird, like the taking of personal responsibility for those factors that are just like, I don't know. But
and of course, that like what's funny about that is like there's a new person like that every week, and I can't tell if it's like, you know, newspapers know that will go viral because people get so angry about it, but like,
well, and the thing about personal finance advice can be really good, but it's all just the same 12 to 15 basic steps. Like somebody wrote a postcard.
Right, Harold Meyerson, yeah.
There's the whole postcard thing that somebody did a decade ago or 2 decades ago. You don't need to update that. It still works. You can get all the information you will ever need on personal finance on the postcard. It's like, don't have credit card debt, pay down your debts with the interest rate first, max out your 401k, you know, blah, like very basic stuff. It's like 8 bullet points. That's all you need.
And people act like it's this like incredibly complicated thing. And like, it can be if you're going through a divorce or when you're buying a house, can be complexities. But 95% of what you need to do is on that one 3x5 postcard.
But anyway, so we've gotten off track.
We've gotten very off track.
So to get us back on track, very simply, what is the one thing that neoliberals should pay more attention to? So is it developing world stuff?
Yeah,
like you're saying?
I would say developing world stuff is always, because it's just so bad, and we're just never attentive enough to it.
Even though neoliberals, I would think, pay more attention to it than other groups, we still should probably be paying even more. I would
agree with that. And something like you know, the immigration stuff is good because it's something you can solve in the context of domestic United States policies. Well, not solve entirely, but it's something where you can make a big impact there. And then, you know, you have like the hard problems of governance and stuff like that, which I think are, you know, where you go to Acemoglu land and you say, okay, I don't know how to solve them. They're big problems to solve, but I don't know how to get there. So I'm always going to say development stuff is the most important. But let me pause and talk about employment stuff because it is what I work on. I have worked on development stuff. I still think it's very important. I want to go back to development stuff sometime in this future when my daughter's a little bit older. But like, you know, one thing I'll say with employment policy stuff. So we were talking earlier about monopsony and minimum wage, and like, you know, obviously minimum wage stuff has dominated that conversation in a lot of ways. But like that sort of general idea of like labor market monopsony is like really applicable to everybody in ways that I think we don't fully anticipate a lot. The Department of the Treasury had a white paper that came out last year, and they were looking and they estimated, they're like, yeah, we think that the average American's wage is about 25% lower than it should be because of this. And there's one thing that I talk about a lot on this is that, you know, there's this concept of monopsony issues, which is like, oh yeah, like there's only one employer. And that's obviously not the case, right? Like we don't have company towns.
Can just mean a degree of power.
Degree of power, but also like what I like to emphasize when I talk about this is like jobs are just really different from each other, right? And so like again, I was working at Ideas 42. I'm now working at Niskanen, and you know both are.
Can I push back on that a little bit? Because one of the things that I've heard, and I think I first heard this point from another classic bad econ guy from Gorbachev, Thomas Hegland. I think he's put his public name out there now. So, but he makes the point sometimes that, you know, especially at the lower end of the scale, the people whose incomes we really care about, you know, in policy wise, so we want to help people at the low end. They jump from job to job way more than you would ever expect. Like once a year or something like that. Like people who are working at service industry jobs or something like that they go back and forth between all sorts of different employers. Like the churn rate is much higher than people in white collar jobs and maybe more than you and I in policy world expect. So like, how does that play into this monopsony story if labor market churn is so high? Number one, I guess, is that correct that labor market churn is higher than we think? And number two, how does that play into the story?
Yeah. I think it's correct that it's higher than we think. I mean, how it plays into the story is hard to say, right? Because why you have to know why people are leaving different jobs or anything like that, and what are the sort of mechanics behind that. If you're leaving a job because you leave your job because you really dislike your boss or something like that, that's you do find another one, but that new job, you don't actually know what qualities that job has in a lot of different ways, and so you're doing these sorts of search processes of trying to find jobs that you like. But yeah, I mean, it isn't that there's one job or anything like that. It's that jobs are these sort of multifaceted, multidimensional constructs that have a lot of things. So you can imagine a policy job of things. You can be do my colleagues like to work in Stata? Do they like to work in R? That's something that can make, if you have preferences over that, and those are very minor preferences in the grand general scheme of things, but that makes a difference, and you might be I'd actually prefer to work at this think tank over this think tank because they have a slightly different code base that I prefer.
And that could be, all sorts of things that, being a mechanic, a car mechanic, at a low level, you can kind of just float between any mechanic shop.
Yeah.
But also, there's a difference between being a place that works mostly on Toyotas as opposed to BMWs.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, you could go do it, but it would take you an adjustment period probably. And there's little frictions like that probably in lots of jobs. So let me follow up here because, I know that the monopsony does exist and it does influence labor markets in ways that we don't see, more than just the minimum wage. There's the classic paper, I think, by Ioana Marinescu, who we've had on the podcast several times, that shows there's lots of monopsony, especially even in small town rural areas, because there's just physically not that many employers. But I guess where I want to go with this is what sorts of policies should we be looking at? What can actually be done about monopsony? And I guess this could either be a question about how do we mitigate the harmful effects of monopsony, or it could be a question, how do we actually make there be less monopsony power? What would you say to that? What can be done here?
No, and that's one of the interesting things that so I mentioned the Treasury report on this, and one of the things that I end up writing about is I loved all of the stuff that they put here on diagnosis, how they sort of went and summarized literature really well, and then they sort of what should we do? And I'm these policies that they had, I thought they had fairly limited impacts, right? So again, you go to and just work on this, and it's really good. But you're okay, and she's now working on antitrust things, and that's really valuable. But it's sort of funny in that the article is going to say, all these things are caused by these big problems with frictions in the labor market, and you say, okay, well, if you're going to just be worried about frictions, you have to not just think about that, but think about how we can actually solve the labor market frictions. So yeah, that's one of the things I've been thinking about recently. And the Biden administration has as well. So one of the things that's been really exciting the last couple of months is the FTC announced that they're thinking about doing a ban on non-competes.
Are we going to say something nice about Lena Khan?
We're going to say something nice about Lena Khan.
I will admit, I am not a Lena Khan person. Not at all. But banning non-competes seems like a good idea. That seems good.
It seems like a good idea. And what I'll say is
except for I will throw out the caveat of people who are legitimately doing cutting edge research of scientific nature. I get that you don't want, there's some level of that, but for 99% of workers, there should not be non-competes.
And I'll put my Dan Takesh hat on, and what he's pointed out is we have trade secrets laws.
Yeah.
We should enforce trade secret laws via trade secret laws and not through crippling the labor market. But I agree that there's an economic justification for that, but maybe not a policy justification, right? So for the listeners, non-competes are basically things that you might sign in a contract when you start a new job, saying you are not allowed to go to our competitors, I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but it's 20-30% of Americans have non-competes right now. A lot of times they're not really enforceable, or there's something that your previous company was only going to do it if you're doing something really egregious. But it is one of those things where like you know, do not have the opportunities you have. And sometimes, like you said, like you can sort of see the reason for like, yes, you're doing cutting edge secret research, but a lot of it is, you know, you are a retail worker or you're, you know, a line cook at a fast food company, and they're saying, okay, you're not allowed to move to other fast food companies without 6 months of non-work, and really ridiculous. So the FTC is considering just a blanket ban on these. California has a blanket ban on these. It seems to be working fine. There's a lot of good debates happening about like, okay, should we do a blanket ban versus, you know, a ban on people who are making less than 150. I'm a blanket ban person because I'm like simple, easy to enforce policies, no sort of complications towards it. But like there's a reasonable debate there. But I think that's something that could make labor market better. Another one I'll put out there that as a little non-neoliberal of me, Adam Osmek, I believe, actually gave me a specific anti-endorsement because I was talking about this last year when I was running for the chief neoliberalship. But sectoral bargaining, which is a framework that a lot of other countries have for union bargaining. So the United States has what's called enterprise bargaining, where you go and you bargain with your company, right? You work at this company and you go and do that. And a lot of countries, most particularly the Nordic countries, what they do is they say, no, like you do bargaining at the industry level. That you say, okay, we're going to get, all the people who work, all the unions in this industry, all the firms in this industry, and they're going to go and sort of set some wage standards on that. And there's sort of interesting sorts of debates you can have there. A lot of people who are sort of pro-sectoral bargaining are like trying to unlock the secret key to make the union movement in America much stronger. I'm less interested in that framework of it, but I do think there's this sort of interesting thing where you say like, hey, if you actually have, negotiated labor standards, negotiated in the free market, right? Like, so it's not the government's imposing these sorts of things, but you say like, aha, here's what labor standards in this industry look like that, gets updated every 2 or 3 years. Then you actually can make that sort of transfer between firms a lot smoother, right? Because you can go and say like, again, like to use our own example of think tank land, if you said, okay, everybody who's a research analyst 1 makes the same salary, and also there's another position called research analyst 2, and you can go and say like, aha, I'd like to, I'm a research analyst 1 in Niskanen, and I'd like to get a research analyst 2 job, and I can talk to Niskanen, but I can also talk to PPI or something like that. That's, again, you can debate some of the things, but I'm like, oh, that's really interesting in that sort of like less frictional labor market stuff. Because like right now, whenever you take a new job, it's a crapshoot. You don't know. You might spend months, you might like your job, and then say, okay, I'm going to interview for another job anyways, and then find out that they're actually offering you like a lower salary or worse health benefits. And you might not even figure like the health benefit stuff until you actually like take that job. So I think that's something that we could be looking into. There's been some stuff happening with that, especially at the state level, with like fast food workplaces starting to do sectoral bargaining, and I think that's sort of interesting. And then finally, the last thing I'll point out here is the stuff I'm working on right now is getting unemployment insurance to work better. Unemployment insurance is, people think of it as I was talking about earlier, like, oh, paying people not to work, but it's also paying people to like take some time and find a good job that matches their skill set. And there's a lot of, evidence and stuff you can look at that says like, hey, you actually really do want that. You don't want people to sort of be forced to take the first job that they can find or to be in, economic distress, but actually be able to say, okay, I'm going to look for a job and take some time. And labor search is really difficult.
One of the things that's come up recently in kind of the discourse, and this is not like strictly labor market policy, but it intersects with labor market policy sometimes, is the CHIPS Act and other big bills that try to push a lot of different priorities at once. And people have been very critical of this recently. Ezra Klein kind of set the world on fire when he coined the phrase everything bagel liberalism. And, he says the CHIPS Act wants to, make America a semiconductor manufacturing hub. But at the same time, it's trying to implement union standards and this many minority contractors and, childcare standards and all sorts of things and environmental laws. And it's trying to accomplish 20 different things. And he says that's a bad idea, that you should just one bill should focus on one thing. I'm curious if you have a take on this kind of phenomenon of we're trying to accomplish 20 things in one bill. Is that helpful, or does it just make you do all 20 things badly?
Yeah, and what I'll say is, I'm mostly sympathetic with Ezra's critique, right? Of like, you're trying to do too many things, and if you take off the focus. I'm not an industrial policy expert. It's like one of the things I'm trying to tech up in a lot the last year or so. But like, the example that I really like from my previous world as a behavioral economist is Herbert Simon, who's got a Nobel in economics and did a lot of behavioral stuff. He wrote some great stuff. It's like, the reason NASA worked, for example, is that they had this extremely limited goal. They had this extremely limited goal of, have a space industry, put a man on the moon, and it succeeds because in part of those really limited goals that it has. And
it wasn't necessarily dictated to them. You have to do it with these contractors and with this specific method, and you have to use this and that, and you have to do it in this way.
But one thing that's also sort of funny about this, so like that's NASA had a mandate. They did this expressly, everything was organized around that. But also Lyndon Baines Johnson's he's like, you know what? I want to have a Marshall Plan for the South. And so he said, you know what? We're going to put NASA in. We're going to, very weirdly, we're going to put it in Houston, and we're going to put it in Cape Canaveral. Not even similar to, located places, but was sort of doing a little bit of industrial policy in terms of looking at, the South former Confederate states, which have sort of lagged behind a lot of the rest of the United States economically for since the Civil War. And one of the things that I feel like, there's this debate that's happening about everything bagel liberalism, and it's happening at this very, very high level ground. But I think what I've been sort of getting more interested is okay, but what is the actual mechanisms you're using to pursue these sorts of things, right? When you say, okay, we're going to pursue lots of different goals, how are you doing that? So NASA, I think, did a great job at its primary goal, but also did okay at its secondary goal. And you could imagine the example I used a while ago, imagine if you said, instead of just, okay, we're going to just straight up locate NASA in Houston, you said, okay, what we're going to do is, 20% of NASA employees must be, the descendants of Confederate veterans. That would be trying to achieve that same policy that LBJ was trying to do, but in this incredibly ineffective way. That would mean NASA could not hire a lot of people they would want to hire. It would have to hire a lot of people that they don't want to hire. And I don't think it would actually have led to them employing more descendants of Confederate soldiers than just simply locating it in the South.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, the kind of insidious thing here is that any individual policy, any single thing can be justified. And you can say, well, this isn't a big deal. It's not going to have a big impact, so don't freak out. And it's a good goal, like the childcare thing.
Yeah.
Individually, just putting a childcare requirement, if you're doing this, if you're part of the CHIPS Act, if you're getting money, you are a company that must provide childcare options. And you're like, okay, that's not a big line item for a lot of companies, and it probably won't be that many people take advantage of it. And ultimately, this is not that big a deal. And childcare is good. It's a crisis in this country. But if you do that for one thing, and then another, and another, and eventually it becomes 20 or 30 things. It becomes this dense book of regulations that you have to comply with. It adds up over time.
Yeah. The childcare one is really fascinating too, because it's interesting the way it gets sold on to the big announcement articles, in the way if you actually dig into the text of the RFPs, basically what it looks like. So when they announced this, the New York Times and the Washington Post and folks had this sort of big, splashy, the CHIPS Act is going to require that employers provide childcare. And I can't remember the exact phrasing of it, and that doesn't actually matter. And then I'm like, oh, wow, that's pretty intense. And then you go and you dig into it, and you're like, wait a second, all this is that when you're applying for a CHIPS Act subsidy, and a CHIPS Act subsidy is $50 million. It's a lot of money. One of the the things you have to fill out is that you have a plan that provides people with access to childcare. And it's sort of interesting. There's a while during some of the 2020 campaign where people are oh my God, this, people saying access to healthcare was this dirty word where it meant they are not doing Medicare for all. Yeah. But you're wait, what does that actually sort of mean? And what I think is sort of interesting here is we don't actually know, right? It's
almost thrown in as well, the childcare people, the childcare coalition,
right,
is part of our political coalition,
and to be clear,
and so we have to give them something, even though this might end up being a really weak thing. It might end up not mattering at all, but we have to just throw some language in there.
Yeah.
The courts will decide later what this means.
Well, not even the courts, but like the Commerce Secretary and the people within Commerce who have the authority to who are actually going to do the ranking of the submissions for folks. And like there's you can imagine versions of this that I would think like that's going to be really bad, right? Like you could say where it's if they go and they judge this and it's a binary. We add 8 points to your RFP score if you're providing free childcare on site and 0 otherwise. I think that's not a good policy. I think that not only from the sort of everything bagel point of view, but also from the point of view is like what that ends up doing is really heavily incentivizing firms to discriminate against parents. That every time they hire a parent, it's going to cost them 50% more than someone else.
The cynical part of me also thinks that this is just a really cynical political maneuver to say that you did something. Because, look, how many people work at firms that are going to be applying for chip subsidies? Like a very small, like 0.01% of the country.
Yeah.
But, so we've not done anything to solve the childcare crisis in this country. But you can point, we did something. This is a big bill, big, huge dollar number. We did something. The cynical part of me thinks that it's kind of like that, but I'll close this point because I want to move on after this. But I'm reminded there's like a famous scene in King of the Hill where the dad is going, Hank Hill is going and his son has gotten really into Christian rock. And he goes up to some Christian rocker and he's like, "You're not making Christianity any better. You're just making rock and roll worse." And I look at them and I'm like, "You're not making industrial policy better.
Childcare better, yeah.
You're not actually helping the childcare problem in this country. You're just making industrial policy worse." And that's how I think about it. But
let me add some just final thought. But like I do think so much of this is going to be at the discretion of the policymakers and these sorts of things. And like I do worry that people get it's so funny to me that the childcare one, which I think is actually like. Again, if you read the childcare one, which you actually read like the text that's been released, like I'm like, oh yeah, that's fairly minor. Like, write a 600-word essay about how childcare will be provided at your facility. You could just get that by saying like, what, we talked to the local childcare people and they assured us that they can increase their capacity very rapidly, and here's the letter from them saying that. Like that would be great for people to do. And especially like, there's a non-trip, like some stuff with childcare is like that sort of coordination problem that like you don't hire any parents because there's no childcare. No childcare facilities open up because no one works as a parent. And like, I think solving that is really worth doing and can be done, very easily by sort of these little planning mechanisms. Whereas again, like if you start doing these like extremely harsh, like everybody has to provide childcare on site, which is how it's being reported in the media, even though that's not what the language says. I think that would be like you said, like that's I can't tell if we're being cynical or naive here. Is it just sort of like, okay, we're going to give the childcare groups who took a loss in Build Back Better dropping. Because that's been something that people have been motivated for and been working for really, really hard. And I don't want to like take that away from them, but like they really took that big loss there, and so trying to give them a win at least on paper, and then saying, well, maybe it does something. Like maybe we don't actually push this as hard as it would be. But again, like I think that it's funny that the childcare stuff has gotten so much emphasis versus like the must buy American steel and stuff like that, which are going to be just really bad.
Yeah. The American steel thing is obviously made in America stuff is
the childcare stuff is sort of interesting. It has discourse because like I think there's like both points sides, and then like the American steel, like, oh yeah, that's just going to make things more expensive. No one's arguing against it, but also no one's supporting it.
I mean, and the childcare thing is also like you're ultimately never going to make childcare affordable for most Americans without like some sort of regulatory relief, because the regulations are a big part of it. Part of it is just that it's expensive to look after kids.
Yeah,
we exist in a world now where we are a rich country. And so we don't want to have the situation where one person looks after 30 kindergartners, because we don't find that acceptable anymore. But if you have if you insist on a 1-to-6 ratio, one adult per 6 kids, That's great. That's maybe better for the kids, but it is going to be expensive, and there's no way to get around that because labor costs are high. And so unless you deregulate that to some extent and give people more options, there's just going to be expensive childcare.
Well, and I'll also say you can solve expensive childcare with, get the child tax credit and giving parents money.
Give people money.
Give people money. Yeah.
All right, so we're coming up on time. I want to ask the traditional final question that I always ask people, which is, what should people go and read and look at if they want to learn more? We've been talking about a lot of things here. We've been talking about the posting to policy pipeline. We've been talking about how the dynamics of social media. We've been talking about monopsony power, labor market policy. Is there anything for people who are fascinated by the topics we've covered that you would recommend that they go read?
I mean, you always just go read twitter.com/besttrousers. I'm planning to have my big UI reform white paper out in the near future, and then we're going to be working on lots of other related things. So I'll always be doing sort of stuff like that. Because of the way Think Tank works, the stuff that you're working on right now does not necessarily get published till 3 months after you're done or longer. So it's always sort of interesting. In terms I'm trying to remember the books and stuff I read. Like I said, I've been trying to sort of tech up on industrial policy recently. So I think the classic book that everyone recommends on this that I will also recommend is How Asia Works by Joe Studwell. Because I think it's a really good book, especially for your audience of sort of neoliberal people who are interested in trade, who are probably industrial policy skeptics. But then because the point that it sort of makes is you can make industrial policy work as long as it's being disciplined by the market, which is why it works really well in Taiwan or South Korea, because they can go and say, hey, we're going to subsidize this program a lot, and then we're going to basically sell it, not domestically, but internationally, so that, the prices are right, and it's not just this sort of...
It's funny, because to me, the biggest lesson of How Asia Works is not the industrial policy stuff, it's the land use stuff. But land reform is the big, giant monster that I think a lot of countries in Asia got right. And then the industrial policy stuff, blah, 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 blah.
But the land reform stuff, not that it's not irrelevant, not that it's not irrelevant to the United States, but in terms of industrial policy stuff. I'll also say the Herbert Simon quote that I have, that's from Sciences of the Artificial. And if you like Matt Darling takes in general, 90% of what I do is I take stuff that Herbert Simon wrote in 1950 and make it translate it for modern audiences. A lot of stuff that I do is taking these great takes that he had that are just expressed really awkwardly because it's 80 years ago and people just didn't have the same conciseness sort of things that we do right now, and figure out how to express that a lot better.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you to our guest and congratulations. I hope that your reign will be a peaceful one. Or you can have a reign of terror.
No, I'm the last neoliberal shill, right? That if Twitter falls apart,
If Twitter falls apart, and apparently Elon said he's going to kill polls, or there was something where he said only Twitter Blue subscribers can vote in polls, and I don't think that's happened yet.
It hasn't happened yet, but
if that happens, that would kill the shill bracket.
That would kill the shill bracket. Blue Sky does not have polls yet, but I'm sure that's something they're working on.
All right, but anyways, thank you so much for coming on the show, Matt Darling.